August 1st is Earth Overshoot Day. Were you aware of that?
I was not aware of that.
Had you heard of that?
No, never have. What is that?
What about the concept of overshoot?
I've not heard of it.
Maybe it's got to do with the climate.
That's a clip from a video I made in 2018. I went out on the streets to catch passersby and find out what they knew about ecological overshoot. This year, 2024, Earth Overshoot Day falls on August 1st. We'll bring you up to speed on overshoot next.
The presidential election in 2024 is probably the most important election in our country's history.
You're looking at a Biden-Trump rematch that 2/3 of the country doesn't want.
I'm Dave Gardner. I'm running for president.
The billionaire class has been taking everything and leaving everybody else to fight for the scraps.
Your right to talk about economic growth and restoring that American dream.
Gross domestic product has now become a fetish.
You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your fairy tales of eternal economic growth.
We humans have outgrown our planet.
Is growth really making us richer, or is it making us poorer?
We've got to scale back.
We need people to reimagine a lifestyle which requires much less energy and material.
Didn't Elon Musk actually say one of the biggest issues that we're facing is underpopulation?
Let's not be afraid to talk about overpopulation, because it is not about taking rights away from people. It is about giving opportunities to women, children, and future generations.
I'm Dave Gardner, and this is the podcast that chronicles my campaign for U.S. President and explores the critical issues. In this episode, we're digging into ecological overshoot, a linchpin to my campaign. Getting out of ecological overshoot needs to be our number one priority. On day one of my administration, I'll declare an ecological overshoot emergency and launch a national campaign to get out of overshoot. Global Footprint Network calculates that Earth Overshoot Day hits on August 1st this year. What does that mean? To get you up to speed, I'm joined by William E. Rees. Rees and one of his doctoral students, Mathis Wackernagel, developed the concept of ecological footprint at University of British Columbia back in the early 1990s. Rees is human ecologist, ecological economist, and professor emeritus and former director of the University of British Columbia's School of Community and Regional Planning. Bill, first of all, I want to sort of make a little bit of a correction to how I introduced you. It's true that you and Mathis Wackernagel did some work and wrote the book in the early 90s, but I understand that you had been developing this ecological footprint analysis concept for a couple of decades prior to that. Is that right?
Well, it certainly goes back several years, a decade at least. Yeah, I grew up partially on a farm in southern Ontario. And even as a kid, I realized that human beings are made out of the land. Basically, we are what we eat. That's a trivial thing to say these days, but it's absolutely true. So I was always fascinated by a simple question. And it seems to me it's the first question of human ecology. And that is just how much of the Earth's surface is necessary to provide me with all the goods and services and food that I consume on a daily basis. And that really fascinated me through my whole life. And finally, when I became able to do something about it, we developed the ecological footprint concept, which essentially asks and answers that question. So we now can look at a person's average annual consumption and convert it to a corresponding land base, and thereby show you what your footprint is, your real mark on the planet is, and a nation, and the world, and so on. Yeah.
So that's really step one in understanding overshoot. What else do we need to know? Do we need to talk a little bit about carrying capacity to complete the picture?
Well, carrying capacity is a very complex issue, even in biology. And when it comes to human beings, it's more so. Carrying capacity is always a population number. When we talk about the carrying capacity of a land base, we mean how many individuals of a particular species could that habitat support indefinitely without being destroyed by overpopulation. But with humans, of course, we have technology, which can temporarily increase the productivity of the land, which then is reflected in an apparently higher carrying capacity. We also have trade, so that if we overshoot our own local carrying capacity, we can import what we need from elsewhere. But of course, that's what globalization has done. It's artificially increased the carrying capacity in importing countries, but the consumers there are unaware that they are drawing down productive capacity and therefore the carrying capacity of the exporting land base. At any rate, the point of the matter is that for human beings, carrying capacity varies with technology, trade relationships, and all of that sort of thing. I've made a mistake here. Carrying capacity doesn't vary with those things. Carrying capacity is fixed, but we befuddle our measurements of it by getting involved with technological adjustments and through trade. Trade blinds us to the fact that there is a carrying capacity. Keep Europe in mind. I mean, Europe uses something like 3 times as much productive land base elsewhere on the planet as there is in Europe. So if Europe were somehow cut off from the rest of the world, it couldn't possibly survive at anything like its current material standard on its domestic land base. So Europe has overshot its local or domestic carrying capacity and thrives on the rest of the world. And so do most countries, for that matter.
I suppose that's why Europeans went off to explore the rest of the world and came to North America.
The wealth of Europe is very much based on the exploitation of resources and forests and agriculture elsewhere. Take a country like Holland, which is sometimes said to be a miracle by economists at least, because it's self-sufficient in food. Well, it's not. It may be self-sufficient in monetary terms insofar as it exports a lot of a very high value-added product, but it grows its pigs and chickens and animals from which the high-processed cheeses and meats and so on are produced. It imports that stuff from elsewhere. So Holland's agriculture is actually based on a land base several times larger than the agricultural land base of Holland, but that's hidden in the imports. And it's certainly not reflected in the statistics that we normally keep. So nations that look at trade in terms of the value of monetary flows, basically, are ignoring the biophysical basis that supports those flows of goods, which they measure in monetary terms. So money is an extremely poor measure of the capacity of a nation to do anything, at least in biophysical.
And, China's got a huge land mass, and yet China doesn't meet the needs of its huge population internally, which is why they're buying agricultural land around the world, I understand.
Of course they are. And even it's a very good case because much of the high-end meat production in China is supported by soy imports from Brazil, I guess formerly the United States, maybe still so. But yeah, it's, again, this flow of biophysical product around the world obscures the fact that something like 80% of the world's people are living in countries that have exceeded their local capacities to sustain their own populations. They are dependent on trade flows. I think if we look at the pattern of land purchases across North America, we'll find that China is heavily involved. Japan is, Saudi Arabia, and other countries are purchasing the productivity of our own land base. And by the way, I mean, we did an analysis of Western Canadian agriculture in the prairie provinces, which is one of the, again, with the US, one of the great grain baskets of the world. Something like 60% of the Western Canadian land base is exported to other nations in the form of agricultural output of one kind or another, grains, mustard seed, canola, and so on and so forth. So we are, in effect, not only supporting most of our own population, although we import as well, but millions of people around the planet are dependent on North American agricultural output.
That's enough to make someone feel like, well, there must not be a problem feeding 8 billion people on the world, around the world. If the U.S. and Canada are exporting so much food, there's enough to go around, apparently.
This is a temporary situation because what we're doing with modern agriculture is degrading the original land and soil base. I'm not up on the numbers, but the last time I looked, something like 75 or 80% of the nutrients of the Great Plains, let's say, that had accumulated for 10, 12,000 years in the post-Pleistocene period, have been dissipated through trade. Every time a shipload of grain leaves Los Angeles or Vancouver, it's carrying literally tons of phosphorus and nitrogen taken from the soils of North America. And in the process of tillage and other agriculture, we're also increasing the rate of oxidation of soil organic material, so that the original organic space of the soils have deteriorated astronomically. And in fact, there's many parts of highly productive North American agriculture, which is basically field hydroponics. The organic material is virtually gone, and so have the nutrients. So we feed them fertilizers and water. The plants can grow quite happily in that, but cutting off the supply of fertilizer and of water, and we're in a very bad situation. We've essentially, to feed the world and ourselves, degraded our own agricultural land base, and we're now dependent on massive inputs of technological inputs, made, by the way, with fossil fuels for the most part.
Yeah, so that can't go on. The returns are going down, and there's only so many.
Diminishing return.
Yeah.
And in fact, a couple of years ago, some group estimated that globally, there's only about 50 years of harvest remaining. So it would be less than that now, if we were to depend on our natural soil base. So oddly, we're in this weird socially constructed economic mindset where this doesn't matter, because the prominent belief in Western society is that technology can substitute for nature. So why be concerned about the loss of soil nitrogen and phosphate and all of that if technology can move in and provide substitutes in the form of fertilizers, for example? So we tend to have, in effect, dulled our senses to our biophysical reality because of our self-aggrandizement and fascination with the notion that technology can fix anything that we happen to screw up out there in the real biophysical world. So I think we're putting ourselves in a very dangerous position, particularly given that we have to get out of using fossil fuels, but there's no substitutes, and so on. You can take it from there. I think we're headed for a rude awakening, let's put it that way.
Well, very well put. So let's go back to basics. So I wanted to start with kind of a definition for the uninitiated of overshoot, ecological overshoot. So you say it, how many dozens of times a day do you have to explain that? You're probably the best person to put in charge of that.
I'm not sure about that. Well, overshoot is really a simple concept. You're simply using more than is being produced and polluting more than can be assimilated. So if you wanted a kind of semi-formal definition of overshoot on the planet, human beings are now consuming more of even renewable natural resources than can be produced in a year on the planet. Every year we consume more than the planet produces. And that's a very simple explanation for what we were talking about a moment ago. We're depleting the soils because of overshoot. We are depleting fish stocks because of overshoot. We are over-harvesting forests because of overshoot. We're using more than is annually produced, which means we're, in effect, eroding our capital base. If you wanted to put this in monetary terms, suppose you had $1 million in the bank at 5%. If you were content to live on $50,000 a year, you could do that indefinitely. But as soon as you decide, why not a little luxury this year and go to 60,000 or 70,000? Well, you can do that for a while. But now you're eating into your capital. You're eroding the capital base upon which you depend. And you're deluding yourself because you can do this for some years that, nothing wrong with that. We can keep doing this. But at some point, it's NSF. You run out of cash. And it's the same thing with the oceans. The fish stocks will cease to be. The forests will cease to be. The soils will stop producing. And if you don't have a substitute, you've put yourself up the creek. The other side is that, look, every real action on the planet involves an increase in what is called entropy. Every real activity dissipates energy and material. And that means that we are disordering the planet. Entropy is a measure of disorder or the randomness. So nature gave us this incredibly complex ecosphere of millions of species working, using solar energy to produce themselves and all of it. Well, human beings have entered into the picture. And by growing themselves and our infrastructure, all of our artifacts and toys, we have dissipated most of the energy provided by nature. We've taken over most of or a very high proportion of the natural flows of solar energy generated by photosynthesis. Most of the world's harvestable photosynthetic product is diverted to supporting human beings, but it's at an enormous cost to the diversity and complexity of nature. So that if you look back, say, just 10,000 years, humans were less than 1% of the biomass, the weight of mammals on Earth. Well, today we're 34%. And our domestic stock is another, 62 or 3%. So we've literally, by growing the human enterprise, eliminated most mammalian biomass. The remaining wild biomass is only 3 or 4 or 5% at most of the biomass on Earth. And we don't notice this in our thriving cities and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is, on Earth, the growth of the human enterprise has resulted in the displacement and dissipation of vast quantities of energy, vast quantities of natural resources, and most of the other wildlife with which we share this planet. So we're literally taking the place apart, species by species, resource by resource. We run out of one thing, we divert our attention to another. So we burn up the oil. Well, it's now going to be electric energy of one kind or another. But of course, that means an unprecedented increase in mining activities and other ways of depleting, destroying the biophysical basis upon which we have to survive. The other half of this whole question of entropic dissipation is the accumulation of all that material as pollution. So every time you consume something, every act of production and consumption is not only depleting the resource base with which you start, but the entire mass and all of the energy reemerges as waste. The energy is re-radiated off the planet as low-grade heat energy, but the waste accumulates, much of it toxic, because we are introducing into this system literally tens of thousands of chemicals that are unknown to nature and therefore can interfere with natural biological processes within the human body and bodies of other species. That's what toxicity is all about. There's even evidence that the falling human sperm count is the result of the accumulation of toxic chemicals in the human body. Microplastics are in everything now. You can't consume a glass of water or a morsel of food without taking on toxic chemicals. So plastics, and these are, again, the dissipative byproducts of the accumulation of entropy, the disordering and randomization of the order of the planet.
Well, I think this is all really important to know because there are things we can do. We can change our behavior. So if any listeners are feeling like, wow, this is a lot of doom and gloom, I think sometimes you need to know about the doom and gloom if you need to turn away from the path toward that doom. So I'm hoping we can motivate and inspire some people to consider the dramatic but joyful actions that we could be taking to get back in harmony with Mother Nature, although that's a tall order.
It is a tall order. Well, human beings are kind of unique in that we sociologists refer to it as the social construction of reality. So we don't, in a sense, live in the real world. We live in our made-up stories of the real world. So people have been literally, I suppose it's a form of brainwashing, led to believe that technology will save the day. So we're living out of this mythic construct, a social construction of the nature of our relationship with the rest of reality that in effect reinforces the consumer mentality that we've been talking about here. So that's the reality in which people exist. So we make up our stories, and there's very little incentive to do what you're suggesting, which is to change our way of being to something else. Because if you really think about overshoot, where we're consuming too much and polluting too much, a simple definition is too many people consuming and polluting too much. And the only real cure is fewer people consuming less and polluting less. Nobody wants to hear that because it means reducing our so-called material standard of living when we have constructed a social myth that it can increase indefinitely. So we've got a lot of problematic issues to overcome here, including the mental constraints. We have to socially construct a new cultural narrative along the lines that you're suggesting, where human beings see themselves as part of nature and therefore bound to respect the realities that imposes upon us.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that makes it so hard, you've alluded to, is that technology has faked us out. And it's hard to believe that it's faked us out for so long, because returning to your student, Mathis Wackernagel, who went on to found Global Footprint Network, which does this great accounting and analysis of our biocapacity and the ecological footprints around the world, their best estimates are that we went into overshoot back in the early 1970s. Now, how can that be? How can we have been in overshoot for 50 years and not just, had our spaceship Earth just completely crash? It's enough because we've somehow managed to stretch that rubber band for 50 years. It seems like we can go on forever.
That's part of our self-delusion, but we're beginning to pay for it now. As I said, once you're in overshoot, you're doing two things. You're eroding the biophysical resources upon which you depend. So over that 50-year period, we've seen a 70% loss in biodiversity among the species that we actually monitor. That's a huge loss for the productivity of the planet and its potential to recover from human abuse. In that 50-year period, we've seen a doubling of energy use and a 60% increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide emissions, for example. So we haven't escaped. Overshoot is beginning to manifest itself in the form of climate change. Climate change is just one symptom of the overshoot crisis. And it is a waste management problem. Remember, I said overshoot has two components: overconsumption on the one hand, but the inevitable pollution on the other hand. Yeah. So carbon dioxide, which is the principal greenhouse gas emitted by industrial economies, is actually the number one waste product by weight of industrial economies. And it's accumulating in the atmosphere precisely because the photosynthetic processes of land and water ecosystems has been overshot. There's just too much carbon dioxide for the natural systems to assimilate. And so the penalty is accelerating climate change around the world. So the fact is, yeah, we've been in overshoot for 50 years, but it takes a long while for such a massive system of the ecosphere to manifest this in real terms. But that's scary because it takes an equally long period of time for recovery to manifest itself. So even if we stop carbon emissions right now, the carbon that's in the atmosphere, suppose we just stabilized it at current levels, according to some estimates, over the longer term, a couple of centuries, that's enough to increase global temperatures by as much as 10 Celsius degrees, which is game over. So there's a very long recovery period after we decide that we're going to treat our planet, our ecosystems, the things supporting us, with a little more respect and according to the biophysical principles upon which they operate.
Yeah, and 10 degrees Celsius, scientists always talk in Celsius, but the American people, that fakes us out because we think in terms of Fahrenheit. So roughly, I think you can just
17 or something, 17 degrees increase, I'm guessing. But,
it's almost double, yeah.
Yeah.
So imagine that. It's hard to imagine that, just how brutal this summer is here today.
Well, especially considering that we're already suffering from, 1.5 degrees increase? Multiply that, well, at least in temperature terms, by a factor of 10. By the way, even 2.5 degrees Celsius increase, say 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit, is enough to destroy civilization. So
a lot of people think that means they just have to turn up the air conditioner.
Powered by fossil fuel, which makes the problem worse in most of the world.
Yeah, they don't understand that agricultural yields are going to suffer greatly, among other things. So you mentioned climate, and that seems to be getting our attention, although we're not doing all we need to do about that. But that's just one, as you said, symptom, or I'll say symptom or consequence of being an overshoot. What are some of the others?
Well, biodiversity loss. I've already mentioned that something like 3% or 4% of mammalian biomass is all there is. of other non-human animals on the planet. Well, humans plus our domestic animals are 97% of the biomass. Of the remaining species that are monitored by the Worldwide Fund for Nature, for example, several thousand species of vertebrates, there's been a 70% loss in the last 50 years or so. We can see the accumulation of ocean acidification, which is affecting productivity of the seas. We see the increase in dead zones in the ocean, excess areas of algal growth. When they die, they decompose and the ocean becomes deoxidified, which results in fish deaths. We see, as I mentioned, the decline in forests around the planet, particularly tropical forests. And many forests, which we have depended on heretofore to be carbon sinks, that is to say, absorb more carbon than they're emitting, are now succumbing to wildfires and other abusive land uses that mean our forests have become net sources of carbon. Canada, right as we speak, we're seeing several hundred wildfires just in my province of British Columbia alone.
Yeah, thanks for the smoke, by the way.
Yeah, okay, exactly. And you saw that a couple of years ago. Most of the eastern part of the United States was blanketed in smoke from burning fires in Canadian boreal forests. Well, that's going on in Asia too. We never hear about it in Siberia or the Arctic of Asia. It's going on in the Amazon. Some say the Amazon is now a net source of carbon as well because of the fires and conversion to agriculture and so on. So bit by bit, no matter where you look, we see this increasing reversal of biophysical processes that are necessary to sustain the life force on the planet. We mentioned just a couple of those, ocean acidification, but ocean warming. The seas are warming, which has an effect on productivity in many places. We're seeing the bleaching of corals. We're seeing land and soil degradation. We're seeing a massive increase in erosion of landslides and whatnot as torrential rains fall in areas where they're not usually found. So yeah, there are many, many, many manifestations. Almost, in fact, every ecological problem you can think of is a result either of overconsumption or excess waste production. So all our so-called environmental problems have nothing to do with the environment. The environment would work perfectly adequately in our absence. These so-called environmental problems are manifestations of human abuse of the environment so that it is no longer capable of functioning as intact ecosystems. I say that we are literally degrading, dissipating, and polluting the biophysical basis of our own existence. By the way, we're sheltered from this by wealth in countries like the United States, Europe, Canada, and so on, because we can literally insulate ourselves from our negative effects of consumption. You mentioned earlier, well, all we have to do is turn up the air conditioning, or in the winter, the gas heater, or whatever it might be, or we import food from elsewhere. But many people around the planet are suffering already dramatically from the changes that are occurring. One study suggests something like a sixth of humanity will be outside of the normal human temperature niche by the middle part of this century. And if we go to 2.4 degrees of warming, or 2.7, which seems to be the track we are now on with just existing policies, by the end of the century, then you might see vast areas of this planet become uninhabitable. So we're faced with the migrations of literally tens of millions of people who can no longer live and grow food in areas that have been inhabited by humans for centuries. So this is a slow, ongoing, absolutely inevitable process if we stay our present course.
Yeah, and I'll say, just because we in wealthy countries feel like we're insulated, I think that's a short-term condition. It's going to be miserable for us too eventually.
And of course it is. And we see the manifestations of the southern U.S. border with the pressures of people trying to migrate into the United States. Europe is suffering the same thing with people trying to cross the Mediterranean, many of whom are meeting their deaths because of the miserable kind of ships that they wind up in, the boats that they wind up in. But these are just the little wedges in the door. These are the warning signals that if we were to take them seriously, we change the way in which we do business on the planet. But so far, we simply think we can cope with this. Build a wall or sink the ships or whatever it might be. It's not going to be that simple in the near future if we stay our present course, which means we get back to your issue. Can we change? We have the imagination. It has to happen. We know what we have to do. In fact, there are hundreds of books and articles every year on what must change if we want to move out of our present situation. The problem is we know a great deal about the what we must do. We know very little, or at least nobody writes about how do you achieve these things. So yeah, we have to change our consumer pattern. Well, how do you make that happen? How do you make it happen? The what's easy, the how is much more difficult.
Yeah, and I've been working for a shorter time period than you. I've been for 20 years trying to do my part to affect this culture shift of getting over this worship of more, and be okay with enough and embrace enough. And I haven't seen any kind of a shift at all, really. No sign of movement. And so I decided, okay, let's change our ways. I'll run for president and actually start to build a blueprint for exactly what needs to be done. But you're right. We have that information. And the tricky part is inspiring the people to do that, or convincing them that there's a real emergency, a real need to make these changes. And that's the brick wall we're up against.
Yeah, you're engaged in a process of social education where a whole society needs to rethink the what again sociologists would call our underpinning cultural narrative. What is the narrative by which we operate day to day? I mentioned earlier that people socially construct our realities. Well, we socially construct the narrative by which we run our lives, and the idea of more and better is part of our narrative. Most Americans have grown up thinking they'll have a better house, a better car, a faster this or that than their parents did. Well, that's our narrative. By the way, things have changed insofar as we've spread that narrative around the planet. So it's not just North Americans or Europeans now, but other people want the same. And of course, if the planet is already in overshoot, then any effort to grow the rest of the planet to North American or European material standards would literally destroy the ecosphere, at least undercut it to such an extent that we would all suffer greatly. So I don't think that's going to happen. In the ideal, again, here's what we should be doing, is sharing much more of the productivity of the planet so that we in very wealthy countries would reduce our incomes and our wealth in order to enable some appropriate growth to occur elsewhere on Earth. But we also have to stop population growth, because right now, even when you are in overshoot, it means that the average level of consumption is excessive, right? If the total planet is in overshoot, just average that over everybody, it's still an overshoot. So even average levels of material comfort, which we would regard in North America as inadequate, are excessive in terms of the long-term planetary stability. So we need technologies. We need habit changes that bring the whole of the planet within the carrying capacity that it's able to sustain. And that means both changing our ways of being as well as reducing our populations to a level that could be sustained, that's the carrying capacity, at what we would regard to be as a tolerable or satisfactory standard of living. But that's against everything we've been taught, because there's always huge differences between rich and poor and so on and so forth. So yeah, you have a lot of narrative building to do, Dave, and I wish you the very best in your run for president to at least get the dialogue going. I mean, there's bits and pieces of it all over the place. But if we could consolidate a discussion around how to reconstruct the cultural narrative by which we in North America and Europe live, we'd be massively ahead of the game.
Yeah, we need a 21st century Gandhi, I guess. I don't know. We need some source of inspiration. So far, it's not me. So far, it's not Greta Thunberg. She's probably come closer to it. But she doesn't even understand or communicate the whole story. So she's really focused on climate, and climate's just a part of it.
That's a very interesting point. In many respects, I argue now that the human brain is obsolete. We evolved in very simple terms, in simple times, in environments that were very constant. We met very few people in the course of our lives. So in many respects, the evolving brain didn't have to, it wasn't challenged much by the environments in which it was evolving. So it was totally appropriate to think in very simple, reductionist, short-term terms, because it didn't matter. That's all that was necessary to survive in a simple kind of environment. But today, we've created a world of overweening complexity, of very rapid change, and yet we're confined to using a tool, our thinking machine, which is used to simple environments and very slow change. So it's perfectly natural for people to think of one issue at a time. It's the climate, or it's the pandemic, or it's the war in such a place. But it's all of these things together. And I don't think any human brain is capable of fully wrapping itself around the interconnected complexities of the multitude of systems that are going off track right now, from the climate to our various cultural paradigms, to who understands the internet, who understands the global economy, who understands how even something as simple as the global shipping network works. Well, nobody. And to put all of these things together in a comprehensive way and say, yes, I know what's going on and I can fix this, is an absolute fantasy that nobody can realize.
Yeah. So let's get into a few details here about Earth Overshoot Day. I think it was smart of Global Footprint Network to invent Earth Overshoot Day, because it really is just a calculation. There's not something physical that happens on August 1st of this year, but it tells us, what they're telling us is that on August 1st, globally, we will have burned through the renewable resources of the planet that take a year to regenerate. We will have burned through them in 7 months. Now, let me see. I want to look at the history a little bit. If we look at the history of Overshoot Day, in a perfect world, we would never hit Earth Overshoot Day, or it would happen at midnight on December 31st, right? That would say we're living sustainably.
You're living within the carrying capacity of the planet.
Right. But a couple of points about that. First of all, I think it's fair to say that their analysis is pretty conservative. Things are actually worse than what they tell us because, for example, they don't really include in their calculations space for all the other species on the planet, right?
Not really. And they don't, look, most pollutants aren't included at all. Okay, so basic carbon dioxide is what we look at, but none of the other major pollutants. So in many respects, you could argue that it's a gross underestimate of the real situation.
Yeah.
But keep in mind, there are whole organizations out there dedicated to proving that eco-footprint is a vast overestimate, that there's nothing to worry about, and that people are being led astray. We're constantly confronted with the criticism that we are absolutely misleading the public, and that it's a travesty. We're a drag on the progressive growth of the human enterprise. I don't care to name some names, but they're well known, and I'm sure you're familiar with them. So you're right. I think we do underestimate, and we're being accused of overestimating.
Yeah, but it's hardly alarmism here. They figure that Overshoot Day in 1971 was December 25th. And then in 1974, Overshoot Day moved back into November. In 1987, it moved back into October. In 1999, it moved back into September. And of course, every time it moves earlier in the year, that's a sign that we're deeper into overshoot. 2005, it moved into August. And in 2019, it moved into July, but then in their revisions, they revised that back to August 3rd. And really, since 2019, it's just sort of been bouncing around very late July, early August. It almost looks like for 5 years, it's been fairly stable and not been moving back. And I just wanted to see what your thoughts are about that. I mean, some people might think, oh, we might have things well in hand here.
Well, I don't know the details any longer of how the calculations are made, but we do know that they're based on available data made available by various statistical organizations, including the United Nations, various organizations that monitor the productivity of land base and so on and so forth. And that changes from year to year as fertilizers spread or become more available. And by the way, that is another way that we're underestimating, because we're looking at the productivity as modified by human use of the land base. Okay. So as productivity changes annually, there will be an effect on the calculations made by the Global Footprint Network. The period you're looking at included the period of the pandemic when it was at its peak. So there was a great change in the trade flows and productivity around the planet as people's lives were dramatically affected by the pandemic. So that's a period of uncertainty, and it doesn't matter what domain of human enterprise you look at, the economy or oil and gas consumption and so on, everything gets a bit befuddled in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years because of that pandemic situation. So there's a lot of things intervening in the calculations of the eco footprint. And I think you'll see, assuming again things level out over the next little while geopolitically, then we'll be back on track. As the poorer populations on the planet increase their footprints and demand for resources goes up, we'll see an increase. Look, oil and gas consumption are at record levels. Despite what now 30 years since the forming of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we've seen 28 COP conferences designed to reduce carbon emissions. Well, in that period, they've gone up by 60%. So even the most powerful forces that we muster in cultural or institutional terms to counteract some of the things we're doing are having virtually no effect. You could argue things would be worse, but the fact is they haven't reversed our carbon emissions. They're still going up.
Yeah.
So one thing we have to recognize here is that even something like so-called renewable green energy isn't displacing fossil fuels. It's adding to the total energy base of society. And that means increasing the rate at which we consume everything else. People forget that energy isn't just like energy. It's a means by which we acquire all the other resources we need to sustain our growth. So you will very shortly see, because energy demand is increasing at 1% to 2% per year easily, we will see an uptick once again in the global footprint as people use that energy to exploit and overexploit the planet.
I'm glad you brought up energy because I wanted to ask you about that. So you've mentioned, if we're kind of wrapping up a little bit here, the things that we need to be doing, and it's clear that, there is no significant effort going on or successfully implemented effort to make us think that our amount of overshoot is bottomed out and that we're about to start climbing our way out. There's no sign that we're at that point. So we know we need to embrace population contraction and accelerate that. We know we need to curb our overconsumption and contract the global economy and especially contract the economies of the overdeveloped nations. Those are two things, let's say economy and population. Should energy be a third item, or is energy somehow a subset of those?
Well, energy is at the base of both of those. If you think about human population and economy, they lockstep with our increase in the use of energy. So, for example, it took, 200,000 or 300,000 years for the human population to reach 1 billion in about 1810, 1820, something like that. 1 billion, 250,000 years. Then in just 200 years, we get to 8 billion. Well, that 8 billion, that eightfold increase in population is almost 1,200 times faster growth than in the previous period. We're dealing with a massive increase in humanity in just 200 years. But it coincides precisely and tracks with the increase in use of fossil fuels. Because as I said a moment ago, fossil fuels is the means by which we acquire the food and all other materials needed to grow the human population. So prior to our use of fossil fuels, human populations globally fluctuated in the vicinity of their local carrying capacities. Carrying capacity was mastered. But with energy and technology, we've been able to temporarily overcome local carrying capacities by increasing local land base, moving goods and services around the planet, and hence grow the human population. There's been in that same period, where there was an 8-fold increase in human population, a 100-fold increase in the scale of the real human economy. So energy again enabled this enormous increase in so-called economic throughput. Throughput is simply the input of raw materials and the output of both pollution and finished product. So energy is key to both the massive increase in human population numbers and the massive increase in the global economy in just the last 200 years. But here's the kicker. Today's population, people living today in your country and in mine, take this to be the norm. So the last 200 years, where we've seen uninterrupted growth between 2 and 5%, something like that over that whole period, we think that's normal. And we've got to stay with this. This is the single most abnormal or anomalous period in human history. And so again, we befuddle ourselves into thinking that just because this is what we're experiencing right now, it's the way things have always been. And that's simply a mythic construct we con ourselves into thinking. And there's any number of tricky games you can play. I mean, if, at this rate of growth for a few thousand years, the mass of humanity would be larger than the sun. I had crazy numbers like that. So it just can't carry on. Yeah.
But boy, there are some bullshit think tanks out there that are trying to convince us it can and it must.
Oh yeah, you've got the what do they call it now? Those who think we can upload our consciousnesses into some global or universal computer and spread trillions of human beings off into the universe ad infinitum. Anyway, it's fantasy.
So, Bill, I've made you, and I appreciate you doing this, and I'm honored to have your time today. I've made you repeat things that you have told people and continued to tell people really well for quite a long time. But I want to, as we conclude, see if you have any new thoughts that you want to share.
Well, listen, I wish people would develop what used to be called critical thinking. Every person in today's world has an obligation to question everything that we're being told, to ask for the basis for those kinds of assertions, to think critically about the ways in which we are seeing the world unfold. We've lost that capacity. And in fact, as I understand it, the Republican Party of Texas has abolished critical thinking from the Texas school system because it might cause students to question the American way of life, for example. And that's exactly what we don't need right now. We need full-on questioning of the way we live, how we might change things. The how is the important thing. We know what we have to do. We just don't know how they do it very well as yet. We don't have the resources to do it. There's billions of dollars spent every year on reinforcing the existing cultural narrative. It's called advertising, public relations, the purposeful obfuscation of critical thinking, the denial of people's capacity to question the nature of the reality. Well, it's not reality, that's the point. It's this constructed reality around us. So my main message would be to think this through. Are you serious? Are you serious? You really think that by 2050 you can have 100% renewable green energy on an equivalent basis to that which is provided by fossil fuel? I'm sorry, it's not in the picture. To put one Class 8 transport truck on the road, an electric vehicle, would require paving over about 75%, 0.75 of that acre of land with solar panels per truck. And if you wanted to make the entire U.S. fleet of 4 million Class 8 vehicles running on electricity, you'd need solar panels covering an area the size of Connecticut. And that's merely one small part of the total transportation system, which is only 25 or 28% of our total energy base. It's just not going to happen. So make yourself literate about the nature of the biophysical realities. Question everything you're being told about how the future is unfolding in this glorious, positive, technology will solve everything way. Because some wag once said, today's problems are mostly the result of yesterday's solutions to some technological question. We are at present eroding the biophysical basis of our own existence. And as long as that continues, I think we have major problems. We're completely capable of turning things around, but we have to have a socially and culturally aware population willing to seize the reality bull by the horns and wrestle it to the ground. Otherwise, it's a lost game.
Very well said. Let's get busy.
Get busy. And good luck on your run for the president.
Thanks. I have some recommended viewing and reading related to Overshoot for you. Get links in the show notes. First, Earth Overshoot Day 2018, the YouTube video that I made, and I shared a little bit with you at the beginning of this episode. It's on my Growthbusters YouTube channel. Second, Spaceship Earth Passenger Safety Briefing. It's a very short video I made. It was selected to screen in the 2015 Wild and Scenic Film Festival, also on the Growthbusters YouTube channel. And then, for a little more fun, some music. Check out on Spotify the Growthbusters playlist. And don't forget the Dave the Planet playlist on Spotify. Also, Overshoot playlist Top 10 Environmental Songs. That was episode 30 of the Growthbusters podcast. There's a YouTube playlist on our YouTube channel. And you can also find this episode on Mixcloud that contains the complete songs, which couldn't be included in the podcast version for the Growthbusters podcast. And finally, welcome to Overshoot. Have a nice day. It's an episode of the Conversation Earth syndicated radio series and podcast. It's a 30-minute crash course on ecological overshoot. Full disclosure, I produced and hosted that as well. Thanks for watching or listening. In case you missed it, I announced last week that I won't be asking for your vote. Unfortunately, my campaign hasn't caught fire, and we're currently stuck with this two-party system. So we all need to vote blue to ensure we take the path of decency and integrity. Now, if Kamala Harris wants me to be her VP, I won't decline. But we all know the public isn't quite ready to support a ticket with the post-growth policies I'm advancing. Seriously, we need desperately to take the dramatic actions I'm proposing in my platform to start contracting our economy and population. But I wouldn't advise Kamala Harris to promise these in her campaign. It would keep her from being elected. But once elected, she needs to start moving the U.S. in this direction, and quickly. I volunteer to be an advisor. So I'm going to keep developing the policy blueprint that will give our kids a bright future. This campaign continues, but let's get Ms. Harris to adopt these policies once elected. Please follow this podcast or subscribe to the YouTube channel so you don't miss an episode. And please share this episode or recommend the entire podcast series to friends, family, colleagues, your elected representatives, journalists, and students. And don't forget to check out my campaign at davetheplanet2024.com. Read about my national project to get out of Overshoot. Donate, volunteer, and subscribe. Together, let's create a bright future for our kids.